Welcome to The Plain Truth, the show where we go into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this time, we have Joaquin Flores, a political analyst based in Belgrade, I believe. Joaquin, are you there?
Hey, how's it going? Good to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm doing okay. Been out of civilization for a long time, you know.
It's a great place to be.
Yeah. I was in one of those places that I guess you could argue is unfree, but a lot freer than the U.S. or something like that, depending
that's
on
often how it goes. Yeah,
something like that. But anyway, so at the moment I'm back in civilization, and but how about you? You've been in Serbia the last couple of years. How are things there?
Definitely. Well, things are heating up here, and as people following world events, the Balkans tends to fall under right now a news category that's a couple layers deep. So, your normal world event train spotters would know what's going on in Serbia. The people, I would say, outside of that, who are well informed, are obviously following the conflicts in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, live conflicts. But where things are bubbling up, people don't always follow as closely. Ecuador, Venezuela, the West Balkans, things like that. These are places that we would be stupid, right, not to forecast an increase in activity going in the direction of destabilization and conflict unless that's countered. So yeah.
So when's France going to invade Serbia? No, just
that's
kidding.
The question, right? Yeah, that's the question. Certainly, we have just briefly an arms race that sparked off between Croatia and Serbia, and we have the U.S. is quickly arming up Croatia, and Russia's been arming up Serbia. And that's something that people will see. This is not my opinion, right? This is something that people who are train spotting this fairly accurately would have the same conclusion. Of course, I'm in the middle of it here, working in the politics, and with our friends who have been fighting in the Donbass. A number of them have retired. One of our colleagues was arrested. Others have gone into the Syrian conflict. These are political soldiers who are also with military training, and so they actually do the members of the brigade, the various volunteer brigades of the anti-NATO forces. And
how about at a high level? Do you think a war is going to break out in the Balkans?
I think that's if I could answer that right definitively, I would I would have some crystal ball.
Not just like Serbian,
Yeah, no, I'm looking at the general.
So Macedonia,
Macedonia,
Montenegro, the whole
right.
nine
So
yards.
the pro-U.S. forces right now in Montenegro have just declared themselves a government, and there's a lot of contests and legal stuff going on. There was in Macedonia a year ago, there was a U.S. attempt operating through their greater Albanian vector, where they got Albanian terrorists to try to stage an attack, but the Russian and Serbian reinforced and trained Macedonian special forces were able to preemptively attack this group that was really actually going to be doing something very similar, this is a year ago, to what happened in Ukraine, where you had protests, and then you actually had live shooting situations simultaneously. And the live shooting situation was nipped in the bud. So then that bought another year or so of semi-stability. And now we're seeing an electoral upset. Basically, what happened just in 30 seconds was one of the stipulations that the U.S. placed in their negotiation not to remove the government in Macedonia was that they agreed that the losing party from the last election would be the one to set the date of the coming election, which is very unusual and in contradiction with most standing precedents, which is that the government announces the election date. And so what happened is that they basically made an election date precisely when there was that, that variable 5 and 8% of the population that upticks this way and then downticks that way. They basically timed the election so they could get with all the different coalition partners and a little bit of intrigue and some switching sides, they got like 51%, And so it was problematic. And so now we're having a big problem in Macedonia that, of course, you have Albania wants to absorb Macedonia, and Bulgaria would also like to absorb Macedonia. Both of them have historic claims. And then you have the Greeks who say there's no such thing as a Macedonian. That's all Greek, and that country is Slavs pretending to be Greeks, pretending to be Macedonians. So that is, the unfortunate predicament of Macedonia is in that, and really their closest regional partner in reality, in terms of what the guy on the street thinks and feels, is Serbia. Governments haven't been as good to Macedonia. The Macedonian government, prior to this last upset last week, was actually officially saying we're friendly to NATO and we're happy to join the EU as a full member, and that wasn't good enough. So we're seeing also a similar parallel thing to that happening, of course, in Serbia with Vučić and Nikolić. The U.S. and NATO are not happy, and the EU is not happy that they're simply okay with NATO driving their trucks through Serbia without paying taxes, that they're okay with eventually joining EU. They're saying that's not good enough, not fast enough, and stop being so friendly with the Russians. God damn it. So that's actually a very serious situation now with this arms race between Serbia and Croatia, which is to Serbia's north. You have the possibility of a whole referendum maybe next year in the half of Bosnia, which is Republic of Srpska, which is not the same thing as the Republic of Serbia. So there is, to give people a sort of mental map, or people looking at a map, so directly to the west of the Republic of Serbia is Republika Srpska, which is an autonomous republic inside of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a majority Serbian state within a state, which has a high degree of autonomy, and based on the mechanisms put into place both in the history of Yugoslavia and in the laws that were inherited afterwards, and how those are incorporated into the Dayton Accords, 20-something years ago, that this is why there's actually a legal, as well as, of course, your standard, self-determination of peoples argument for a referendum, which would see this republic, Republika Srpska, this little Serbian republic, become independent and have the possibility to rejoin Serbia proper, or to join Serbia proper. And so then, of course, you have continual Albanian terrorism in Kosovo, the persecution of what has become a Serbian minority, of course, over a period of relocation of people, ethnic cleansing of Serbs. So you have that mess right there. This is actually, the Balkans is a huge shit waiting to pop. So excuse my French, but
well, okay, but I guess it gets the bigger picture, because that's a playground for, Germany, the U.S., Britain, and Russia. And so what do you think the players are trying to achieve? What is it the EU wants, for example? Right? What is it that America wants, in your opinion? Or would we get back to your earlier thesis that, for example, basically Europe's divided, there are like 3 factions or whatever? But still,
generally with Europe, you have, of course, 3 factions. The world is much, the map is not the terrain, but to give a loose map, there's basically 3 factions. Of course, individuals are sitting in multiple chairs among the elites, and you have different business interests. And a lot of those business interests are not happy with this relationship with Russia, in terms of having a bad relationship based on a sanctions regime. And the Austrians in the last week have become increasingly vocal, and they want to actually bring it as an issue to the floor in Brussels that actually this sanctions regime against Russia has had a worse effect on Europe than it has on Russia. So they're going with that track, with that argument, which is I don't think that's the moral foundation to argue against the sanctions regime, but certainly is a pragmatist approach, which may have more weight, right, in Brussels and in EU community countries. But looking then from the Balkans, you have with now I think there has been an attempt to reorient U.S. Strategy. It looked like that was Trump's idea. That they were. I wrote about this recently in an article that was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Eurasian Affairs. That the U.S. This is number 4, issue number 1 of 2016. And I wrote that the U.S. is basically probably, this is again under if Trump were to get his way, and that's a separate issue, outside of this thesis that the CIA is boxing him in and trying to force his policy in different directions. That outside of this type of coercion, and I'm not championing this alternative either, but what the U.S., what Trump and those, let's call them Team B at this point, folks, wanted to do was to actually look more at Latin America and look at the relationship between Europe and China that have with Latin America. Even though, of course, we know that the pink tide in Latin America has suffered setbacks, of course, with the parliamentary coup in Brazil, the economic issues with the oil exporting countries like Venezuela, and then related countries to the Bolivarian project that depended on Venezuelan political support, has, of course, been a problem because the price of oil per barrel isn't where it needs to be for Venezuela's economy to perform as primarily an oil exporting country, right? You have the Orinoco offshore speculation, and those projects can't even continue at the present prices. So that, of course, allows the U.S. to move in on its Latin American policy. Of course, while they seem to be doing that, and I think that all of the U.S. elites would agree that's a good thing, if they can also hold on to Europe and contain Russia and China. But strategy doesn't obviously work out that way. So we had, on the one hand, prior, let's say from Nixon through the Clinton and Obama period, this strategy of having a pro-China policy as a way of containing Russia. Well, that helped in a way to lead to the collapse of the USSR. And then, of course, in 8 years after that, China was recognized as a most favored nation trading partner, member of the WTO, and also enjoys special trading rights with the U.S. in terms of tariffs and taxes. And that is the situation in which Trump approached, looking at how, rather than using China as a hedge on Russia, how they could use Russia as a hedge on China and kind of reverse that policy, and then to reintroduce American hegemony in Latin America by inserting itself, once again, sort of as a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, as the middleman, that, in other words, any future deals that China and Europe want to make in Latin America would have to be brokered through the U.S. because right now you have lucrative direct relationships, especially in the Spanish banking sector, between those banks and, say, for example, Venezuela and Brazil. And the U.S. is very happy to insert itself in the middle of that, right? To re-exert some control, going back to when, infamously companies like United Fruit and U.S. Steel and Tin were behind this and that coup and intrigue in Latin America over the last.
Hey, we got the patent on banana republics,
That's right, we got that patent. So. Because of all of this, and looking and trying to assess things objectively as possible, quite frankly, things are speeding up. I mean, we don't have these types of events happening in such a succession so quickly in past periods. So that usually, when you have a lot of things changing, you have opportunities, but you have more peril than opportunities, I would say. There's too many X factors in the mix right now, and it really increases the tensions and paranoia and the chances of things getting crazier, as they probably will get crazier between states. So it does, as we've said before, this does feel like those few years leading up to the First World War. A lot of these alliances are moving forward very foolishly, and because they're intractable alliances that are not based in many of these countries' national self-interest. What I mean is, of course, it's certainly not in, for example, the interest of Ukraine to be at war with Russia, right? It's a few elites at the top who are perhaps going to be overthrown any minute by their own former base of supporters who are pushing this agenda that's really not popular, even in Ukraine. Dissent in Ukraine, of course, is silenced because they have really no voice for journalists and activists in Kiev. They would be imprisoned or harassed.
Well, that's like one issue. The other issue, though, is that, elites are conflicted and divided. Like, let's say Turkey,
Right.
Is it now back on the anti-Syrian bandwagon, which many argue that they're now, going to break off from Russia again.
Right.
I have no idea if that's true, but I'm just saying, in other words,
yeah.
you have these tactical alliances that they were like alliances that lasted 4 weeks, I mean, we're kind of,
Right.
They're not real, and a lot of us had doubts about them in the first place. I
Yes.
mean, not really trying to pick on Erdogan, but I think that's an example.
No, that's a great example. I mean, you had also, of course, you had Russians attempting to do something that they haven't done previously, and this was a new track. They're trying to understand how to do this. Again, one thing I love about speaking so candidly on your show is that I'm able to do that, and it provides a great platform to get things off my chest through my work and in my contacts.
Go for it.
As your listeners on our past episodes would know, are not small, are not minor league contacts and people I'm working alongside. So I do get things directly from the horse's mouth from time to time. And being an intuitive person like yourself and being so close up in it, I get my own ideas from time to time. One of these is that really the Russians were trying to do a type of black trick or black hat trick propaganda move with Turkey, and try to convince Americans who were unclear, American security and intelligence military analysts who were unclear about what Turkey was doing and how it was going to respond to the failed coup attempt last summer, and what that would mean. And it looked like the Russians were using several of their non-state, but nevertheless, let's say, loyal opposition, semi-critical, independent, analytic websites and so forth to promote a view that Turkey was with Russia on Syria. And I think that this was, clearly overstating the fact. Clearly was, but they would have known that, because they're not stupid people. And what they were apparently trying to do was to make at least enough Americans think that the Russians were convinced that Turkey was with them, and that that would serve some benefit, because that belief in itself could go several different ways, right? So it seemed like that. So I have not publicly been able to kind of really go out there and disagree with that. My biggest critics, of course, do listen to your show because they try to mine sentences and lines, bits and pieces of my biography, and so forth, to kind of put together exactly what I'm doing and who I am. And I've basically spelled it all out here before on your show, and I've been hit with that a few times, but only by lunatics, so it's all good. That said, so it's actually pretty clear that the Russians were trying to attempt to confuse everyone, including their own supporters, because if supporters believe it and then they believe that there's a reason, then others will believe there's a reason they believe it. That's a good reason, and so on. So.
Well, I seem to recall a few years ago that famous guy Surkov wrote a little, not exactly a novella, but a little fiction piece on this whole idea of a war where everything is, unclear. You don't know who's allied with whom, and it was referring to the Ukraine at the time. It was
right.
And for the listeners who don't know, Surkov, I guess his actual name is Dudayev, or his original name or something.
Right.
But anyway, he's one that more, I guess you would say, nationalist-oriented. People
right.
in patriot types in Russia or in the Ukraine of a pro-Russian slant have seen as being a representative of the oligarchical faction in the Kremlin that they don't like. Not saying that's all true. We can get into that. He came out of a PR background, I guess.
That's right.
TV kind of background, and that's a long topic in and of itself. But I'm just saying there's certainly this strategy of confusion that you can imagine, and maybe that was part of the Russian strategy in the Ukraine.
Yeah, it's all connected, of course, to our past subjects on fourth generational warfare and new media manipulation and how to simulate and synthesize viral campaigns, how to create the impression of popular support, which leads to actual popular support by the law of attraction, laws of human nature, and so forth.
Humans wanting to go with a winner and seeing a good idea and feeling like they're part of the club. The whole human nature. Well, since we got into that, why don't we get into those two topics then? Syria and the Ukraine. We're there. Might as well say a few words. So, how do you see things going in Syria, Turkey, Iran, for starters? And one wild card. Many people speculate there might be a wider war in the summer. Israel trying to wipe out Hezbollah. Any thoughts on that?
Certainly, yes. So, an interesting point on that. So, the Sixth International Conference hosted in Tehran every year on the pro-Palestinian Intifada to commemorate the Intifada and, of course, to promote its success.
Mm-hmm.
And Hezbollah as an Iranian-backed Lebanese actor is something like a state within a state inside of Lebanon. And one thing that we know is that Israel actually sees itself in somewhat of a deficit in certain areas in comparison to Hezbollah, which is strange because they're not even a state actor. But they have something like a regular army. In the war 11 years ago, they dealt a serious blow to Israel. They defeated them on the battle. They annihilated these supposedly indestructible tanks using 20-year-old equipment and with slight modifications, and just worked brilliantly. And it's just amazing the lack of tactical common sense that the Israeli military displayed 11 years ago. It's hard to, looking at the lack of change-ups in the general staff in Israel, looking at the lack, I don't know internally if they have changed their dogma on war, but if they were to approach that the same way again, I think they'd be beaten again. There was an infamously stupid move when they brought a whole line of tanks through a canyon, and then they were just all blown up from the beautiful vantage point of this canyon with these RPGs and handheld anti-tank stuff. I mean, it's just incredible. So looking at, and then of course you have in Israel a recruitment-based system. You have a type of society inheriting still several different conflicting mentalities. You have, of course, this over-worrying Jewish Slavic mother type of thing happening at the same time with the attitude of the original settlers of Israel, who are more militant and more ballsy. The military today in Israel is all mandatory. So you're 18, you go serve for a couple years, as people know. They have very low morale, and as we know, they get issued diapers when they go into conflict because they're known to piss their pants. So this is the type of army that one is dealing with Israel. When I was growing up, it was always, oh, Israel has the best air force in the world, and it was all this, pumping up the power of the Zionist state. And then we saw them really fail once they were fighting people that actually could, shoot back, not unarmed Palestinians. They got really embarrassed. So.
I would phrase it in another way, though. I think that morale is very, very well. I'll put it this way: for a country, having a purpose is a really good thing, and in a war, you need a purpose, and you also have to have morale. And I would think that it's a safe bet to say that Hezbollah has excellent morale. And, a lot of people in Israel, it's like, why are you fighting? I mean, what what I'm trying to say? They don't.
Right.
And if you see a leadership that you think is intentionally just like crazy about we want to bomb Iran or something like that and doesn't really want peace deals, anyway, and you just have the social thing. You have essentially like a European culture of some sort, like in Tel Aviv,
of a sort
there.
Yeah.
Of a sort, but you know what I'm trying to say,
rude,
like,
but
yeah, but you know what I mean,
like
the kind
Europe,
of European
except rude.
culture in Tel Aviv where it's like you have the good life and like the last thing they're interested in is being in the army or having a war.
Really, that's the truth. And to piggyback on that, remember just a couple of years ago, we had occupy Tel Aviv and tent cities, and you have basically, and these aren't the supposedly dispossessed. These are all really college educated people in Israel who there are no real jobs. There's no affordable housing. People are living in 25 square meter apartments, paying $900, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 a month. And it's unlivable, right? And then so they don't have a lot of support, and the only way they can kind of keep people in line is to distract them with this threat of Iran or Hezbollah.
Well, but then that morale thing though plays into all these conflicts, and it plays into the quality of the U.S. military. But anyway, let's move on from the Hezbollah question to what do you see happening in Syria?
So there are different popular views right now, really surrounding several things. That there was some stories that were being floated. They were partly sort of like test balloons. There was some misinformation, some info wars going on, of course, about would Russia support changes to the Constitution that would kind of decrease the secular nature of it, increase the sectarian nature of it, something in between dividing up Syria and pre-war Syria, right? So that then you have, what are the Kurds going to do? Will under some sort of deal, the Syrians increase the recognition of an increased autonomy of Kurds within a Syria that was like a federal state? And these are all floated in ways for different reasons. I think that would be more than a mouthful to explain, but it again follows the general lines, the general rules of test balloons and how they work. And you're trying to gauge reaction, but not just public reaction. You're trying to gauge reaction from certain actors, not just opposition actors, but your supporting actors. And there's you can also suss out who was pretending to be a supporter as soon as they jumped on a bad version of the proposal. And there's many different ways that this plays out in terms of cleaning house. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that they are really looking at something in Syria that's closer to what the U.S. wanted, in terms of what their stated goal of federal type of Syria. So in reality, of course, we know they wanted to divide up Syria, make a failed state, perpetual conflict, and then just have little carved out enclaves of what was important to them strategically, like the places that oil pipelines went through, et cetera. But outside of that, it's fine to have a complete failed state. So that was if one looks at the conflict in terms of a failed state or something like a federal system where maybe the Kurds even have an independent state in the north would be, much better solution than no Syria at all. But it would behoove anyone looking at the subject, of course, not to forget that the last year has generally been successes of the Syrian Arab army against these terrorists and invader outfits. And of course, we had, infamously or famously rather, the liberation of Aleppo at the end of 2016. So that was.
Well, we shall see. I think if it also depends on what the Trump administration wants to do. If they're going to make a serious push for a Kurdish region, I don't know. It might be hard to stop. But what do you think?
It's, working through it and trying to work out all of the different possibilities is very hard, because for every possibility, there's another 5-10 fingers of possibilities that you would then, map out. So I try
a lot
not
of variables and all this.
Too many variables.
Sure.
Yeah, I really, it's too hard. It's too hard really to forecast. I'm really what is making things very difficult right now, and I think this has been at least a success on the point of the American deep state, is to really confuse analysts, and I would imagine also planners and strategists in other states, what is actually happening in the U.S. with the CIA versus the presidency, and what's really happening, who's really in charge of policy. There were a couple of critical and rather revealing public statements that were made by Zakharova from Russia, who is the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yeah, mm-hmm. And she was clear that besides that the United States had been threatening at the negotiating table, threatening Russia with things getting ugly and scary, that I'd almost really rather not say. I feel like it's.
Well, how about we switch then? I mean, briefly, for those who aren't aware, a lot of things have happened. Today, another Russian diplomat died in Greece. And that's on your website, an article about that, which is fortboost.com.
We just printed a correction on that piece. It was actually from January 9th, so maybe our count is back down to 4. But nevertheless, it is still no less of a problem. Certainly those things have, these type of events have increased. Look, there was in Ukraine, while they're not diplomats and they are certainly military leaders, we had Motorola was assassinated, and then a month or two later we had Givi was assassinated. And that was huge, right? That was a huge.
Well, there's a long list of things, though, that raise questions. I mean, the plane that went down off of Sochi.
Right.
Certainly, I don't know, but it kind of vanished as a topic. Let me put it that way. I look at, Russian blogs and things and news sites, and it's like the government says it was the flaps, and then, in less than 24 hours, no more articles to be found. Raises questions. Let me put it that way. So,
yeah, I mean, certainly, if I could just jump in on that, then really, I mean, on the one hand, we remember when the Russian plane went down in Egypt, and Russia was very quick to come in and say, this was a mechanical error, pilot error, or something like this, to try to really get away from the rush to judgment that it was terrorism. Turned out to be terrorism, but so we can see already that there's the Russians, of course, don't want to appear like they're being hit, and it's better for them to claim. Unless there's some particular, situation where they can really wave the bloody shirt. Other than that, they of course would want to not expose that they have been really effectively hit in many ways with these American-sponsored assassinations and terrorist attacks.
Which, by the way, different U.S. government officials have said they were going to do.
Correct.
Morell of the CIA on, I think it was the Charlie Rose show, and then I think it was Samantha Power somewhere. But
Yes.
the different people basically said they were going to do things like this to make Russia pay.
That's right.
And, so, that's something to keep in mind. But while we're on this nasty subject, maybe for a few seconds, we can see if you have any thoughts on the more speculative question. If you've followed the WikiLeaks and then some of the other things, the FBI Anonymous and that whole the issue of what's been going on that's mostly internal American politics, some have argued, like FBI Anonymous, that basically some of the people who were backing and around Hillary really had a plan for a huge war.
Right.
War with Russia being the obvious thing, but war in the Middle East as a provocation along with other provocations. And that this was largely mounted out of the 7th floor of the U.S. State Department, which new Secretary of State Tillerson immediately cleaned out, like closed everything down the first day he's on the job. And I don't really know, but other people talk about the Samson option, that some of these people, which unfortunately gets into the whole topic of massive pedophilia, human trafficking, and worse.
Right. This was, it is, I know you have a question, but just to sort of comment really on that, this is really all part of this period that we're in. I mean, they're talking about the Pizzagate thing. It's mind-blowing, right? So I feel right more off balance now than a couple years ago, and the information overload has made sorting through things very difficult.
Well, I'm with you. I don't. I feel like we're in a huge quickening. More things happen in 1 week now than happened in 1 month a year or two ago.
Right.
Putting it mildly, it might be as much happens in 1 day as happened a month ago, as happened a year ago in 1 month or 2 years ago.
Right.
And your point about we don't know what the deep state is up to in the U.S., well, then we also, I mean, you're phrasing Team A and Team B in kind of an imperial posture, but there's another way of looking at it, which I'm not saying is true, but many make the argument, which is that there's like a Team A, which we can argue was behind Clinton, and that faction was for maintaining the empire and world dominance at all cost, even if it's slipping out of our hands. In other words, world war if necessary, right? Whatever it takes. And then Team B is the restructuring faction, and more of an industrial basis and production basis, making things and, digging for things and, you know what I mean?
Right.
More industrial capitalism as opposed to finance capitalism, which has been the model for the last, 25 years or whatever. And and I'm not saying that version is true, but it also seems to be in play, because you look at it and you can say, well, okay, but here's the thing, that restructuring involves throwing away half of the empire, right? You could refocus and keep Latin America or something, but you certainly can't plan to dominate Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, as well as restructuring. That's just
right.
Something's got to go. You got to give at least one of those three up, if not two.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at the people dominant in the Western world, but especially the Anglo-American faction, and I'm just very curious. What are they willing to give up? Which of the three, or two of the three, are they willing to give up? And you get the feeling that if they're going to give something up, they want to blow it up first. So if they got to withdraw from the Middle East, they want it to be in ruins.
Right.
And you would think the economically rational thing would be to focus on Asia, because that's where you could sell weapons and, do business. But anyway, I don't know. But I'm just saying there is that other way of looking at how you would define Team A and Team B, and that Trump would be backed by serious deep state players.
Right.
He wouldn't have gotten there otherwise.
Absolutely. Well, there was the Brookings Institute, as I cited in my last paper talking about really American policy, it's titled Pax Americana or Pan Americana, and really looked at so these ideas are not in conflict, right? So the United States would need to balance its speculative economy with actually making stuff. They would need to actually decrease the value of the dollar so that those exports would be purchasable. Trump actually ran on that, but instead of saying that the U.S. would have to weaken its dollar, he was saying that China should strengthen its yuan. The problem is that we have these funny associations with the word weaker and stronger, right? So he wants a weaker China, and this is what he's saying, right? He wants a weaker China, and so they need a stronger currency for them to be weaker, right? And with America, he's saying to have a stronger America, you need a weaker currency. So he can't say I'm the weak dollar president because people don't associate, they don't get that, right? So they don't understand that it only makes foreign produced goods more expensive, but on the domestically produced stuff, it's apples and apples, right? So that is not a plan or possibility that's in conflict. This idea of restructuring the internal American economy, and what I wrote about was that they would actually try to integrate further with the Latin American economy and sort of do something different. That if the United States were to basically stop being an Atlanticist power with its focus on the Navy, right, and sort of in the British trajectory historically, instead to be a land power, a continental power, and to disengage from Europe, disengage from Syria, maybe after blowing it up, right? To disengage from these conflicts and to refocus, as you described, the economy, the productive nature, talking about any kind of push against the speculative aspects of the economy, which have had a deleterious and have imbalanced consequences on market prices. So I think with that all together, these are not ideas in conflict, right? So they could certainly, they're uninterested with an outright war with Russia. The way that they would be able to have their control on Europe is by controlling its access to Latin America, but it would also, in part of that, would be to allow Europe to have normalized relations with Russia, and then to do something similar to what they thought they might be able to do with Yeltsin, which is to bring Russia as a tamed state into the European Union in some way, without being part of NATO. And Russia kind of also has this view, but they call it the Eurasian Union, but really words aren't as important here. It's the concepts, the networks, the relationships that are important. And for all of those reasons, there's been so much pushback from European elites over the sanctions regime. Some of these interests may be able to click up with or get behind a change in American policy. So in other words, the trade-off for Europe would be that they're no longer going to get hit for having a relationship with Russia, but relations with Latin America would go through the US. So everything's a deal, everything's a trade-off. I have yet to really get into Trump's art of the deal but I've in following the way that he's approached his campaign, his messaging, the way that he was able to set things up, it looked like many steps in advance. I mean, this is probably, in terms of a strategist and a world leader or thinker, something closer to how Putin is able to operate, more than we've seen anywhere else in the present time.
Well, we haven't had very many, I think you would say, like grand strategists since Nixon. Nixon was the last thinker, I think you would say, on a strategic perspective. And I would argue that his rational strategies led to his downfall. But
Mm-hmm.
that's another show. That would be another show. However, here's the thing, though. Trump, has Steve Bannon as his brains. And I mean, you can read what he said today at the conservative conference, and it's no secret. He basically, and some of the people that Trump is backing, like his ambassador to the EU, want to break the EU. They love Brexit, and they want to break up the EU, and they don't like the euro. And that's a whole nother factor that gets into an issue that you're going to be quite aware of, which is the rise of alternative politics in Europe.
Right.
Whether it's Le Pen in France or wherever, Austria, many of them are kind of populist right, but I suppose some of them are left or whatever. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
For sure. So I think that's a great segue too, and it actually, of course, ties into all these questions of things quickening. And what really is happening, in my view, with Brexit is far more complex than it being something that is anti-American. In fact, I think that Brexit holds different possibilities, and there's different ways that it can go. But I think that when Obama was publicly opposing Brexit, that was perhaps something different from the U.S.'s actual policy, which was pro-Brexit. I think that, in fact, it's those closer to the Americans who are pushing for a fast and quick Brexit. And there's a lot of reasons for that. These are reasons for the same reason that the pound was never integrated into the euro. It was always England, well, as Orwell described it, although it's cliched, of course, at this point in time, called England, what was it, Airstrip 1?
Or it was Airstrip 1.
Yeah, and I think that England has continued to play the role of Airstrip 1, and when they were in the EU, and we have to separate the words of the French leadership and the German leadership from the actions of the French and German leadership over the issue of Russia. In fact, despite the rhetoric, there has been tremendous resistance from significant portions of those behind those leaders, say Merkel, to the Russian sanctions regime. And just as the U.S. would rather see the Middle East as nation building in the Middle East as a failed project and to create mayhem, they may have no problem doing that with Europe as well. I mean, certainly both world wars were instigated by the players who control the U.S. at that time and staged a war in Europe, really against Europeans, if you think about it like that. Especially
Joaquin, come on. Mm-hmm. Look at American history. Every disaster in Europe has helped America.
There you go.
Not just wars, famines, the 1848 rebellions, you name it, right? It all helps America. It's all good. So there's that. But when you're mentioning Airstrip 1, you do remember the three blocks in 1984, right? Oceania, right. East Asia, and Eurasia.
Right.
Maybe that's where we're heading.
Oh, we are most definitely heading to a multipolar world. And these are blocks. And one of them is, interestingly named, the Eurasian bloc.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly,
that's another possible angle.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that Russia has a problem. Is that it's obviously it's an oil producing and natural gas producing country. It makes up a large part of its economy and keeps it solvent to the extent it can remain solvent, and that makes it very difficult. Back in the 90s, the U.S. took control of Russia's gas and convinced them to sell it so cheap because they were saying, we're going to have solar and new energy around the corner, and this is going to be worthless. So sell it at these fire sale prices today because you're not going to get anything for it tomorrow. and that was the official line that at least was used to justify the plunder of those resources before Putin was able to come to power. Mm-hmm. But that really places Russia's interest in the energy field at odds with, I think, the interests of humanity on the planet. Only insofar as that really there must be on some level some awareness in Russia that, you know, the discoveries of people like Tesla and so forth, free energy are out there and could be developed. People running engines on water. Yes, of course, right now it's the science and, you know, how much energy you put in to make the machine that can refine the water, and, you know, the looking at the net gain or net loss in terms of joules still needs to be worked out. But there hasn't been any public or serious effort to move society globally in that direction towards free energy, and that would liberate, you know, billions of people from poverty, and it would create the basis of a different type of civilization on the planet. And we're not able to get past that. And it seems that really in just 20 years ago, we were living in a time, of course, there were conflicts in the Balkans and elsewhere. The U.S. was involved in other dirty wars under the Clinton administration. But, you know, there was a sense that the Cold War was over, and then you had the rise of major successes, at least in Europe, of the environmentalists, the Greens, and there was this whole other discourse.
It was the end of history, Joaquin.
Exactly, it was the end of history, right? You had Francis Fukuyama up at Stanford, you know, saying this was as clean a sort of pseudo-Hegelian gesture, which he later retracted. This is the end of history. But I think that all of the you know, riots and disease epidemics and wars and tensions that have increased and have really distracted. Of course, the activists are still active on that subject, but they've been pushed to the side by peace activists, by people calling for different organizations of the world order, people trying to avoid war, and a forward agenda about what the world should look like, right, has been really, I think, put on the back burner to the detriment of everyone. So I'm not critical of Russia and what they've had to do. Of course, they have a marketable product. They need to sell it. And it's, of course, not the Russians who are buying up every single free energy patent and disappearing the inventors and then, you know, ripping up the blueprints as happened over the last century.
Years.
Yeah.
Well, okay. There's a segue here, though. Okay, and this is an important question. Okay, in the last couple of years, or at least since, let's say, the Ukrainian situation, how would you grade Russia or the Kremlin in terms of, how can we put this nicely? You know, lessening their dependence on this kind of neo-colonial status they had, you know, where they're like, you know, a big Nigeria, but with a great army or something. You know what I mean? I mean, the people who complain, you know, in the Russian blogosphere and all that, you know the names, of course. All of these people have been complaining forever. You know, the interest rates are usurious, and, you know, they used to be an industrial powerhouse in the world, and now they're down there in the, you know, down there with Jamaica or something.
Right.
So how have things changed? What do you think Russia's done in the last, let's say, 3 years that, you know, have increased independence and reliance and, you know, ending so much, reliance on oil and really just, you know, reindustrializing the country or something? How do you think things have been going?
So when I want to say January of 2014, forgive me if I'm wrong, the ruble crashed, and the Bank of Russia introduced emergency measures, a number of them, of course, to stop the trade of rubles, to stop the hemorrhaging of its value. These small measures that go a long way. Simple measures that go a long way, I should say. Not small in scope, of course, but simple measures that went a long way. Then the government announced that, well, as much as we want to restore full trade relations with all of our European partners, the fact that we are in a sanctions regime is forcing us down this sort of path of import substitution industrialization, is what it's historically called, at least going back to Latin America in the 1930s. Import during the Great Depression, and this ISI economics was, to a certain extent, I think, I'll say to a certain extent, put into effect in Russia. I think that the public discourse on it was greater than the actual. I think the marketing was ahead of the actual product, because they had to sell that to the public as we're doing something about it. Of course, there's a lot of pushback from different elites, business owners, and oligarchs connected to import-export, that we're going to be hit by that. But if you can go to Russia today, and there are no bread lines, and you don't have this tremendous poverty and homelessness like you have in New York or London or Los Angeles, right? So they have a different view of crime, and so they're aware of it, and they have their own internal immigration problems from people who are from former Soviet countries, and of course their parents and ancestors built the Soviet Union, and there's arguments: do they have a right to have Russian citizenship? Should they be treated as foreigners? It's an ongoing thing, and there's these tensions inside of Russia. And when, of course, Russians and anyone who lives inside of their country and they're caught up in the national dialogue, it's always worse when you're in it, and other places seem less bad. I think from the outside looking in, and or being inside of Russia and then being on the outside looking in, I have, in my view, seen that situation is not bad in Russia in terms of general conditions. Kids are going to school, trains run on time, you don't have tremendous violence like you have in Chicago or London. So on that end of things, it's actually a functioning society. I think any American that went to Russia today, once they got past the exoticness of it being Russia, would be like, God, this feels a lot like how America was, in the 1950s or the 1970s, maybe even, right? So in terms of people's attitude, the sense of community, how people treat each other on the street, and Slavs have a different disposition, and they're not optimistic anyway. And they can undergo.
Hey, Joaquin, I met an optimistic Russian once.
Yeah, once you did.
That was about 20 years ago. But okay,
yeah.
Just to keep the record straight.
Right. It's an endemic or inherent feature in the Russian mentality, and Slavs generally share this pessimism, and even taking to your life a beautiful woman, you'd say, yes, but she's growing older every day, and that we all die eventually. So. It's this sort of, right. So I think that, Russians don't have, they were never, they were not ever sold completely on this, Western thing is what makes the world perfect and great and everything. And they had already in a let's say non-capitalist for the sake of categories, non-capitalist model or state capitalist model or whatever in socialism, that produced all of these things, and the space race and the nukes and the first man in space, and a lot of technical achievements that weren't produced by free markets and all that, right? So they don't have that view that it's modernity through the Western world that's going to bring about some utopia on Earth, and they're not even looking for that, right? In trying to grade Russia overall, I think it's hard to evaluate. If I were to say like A, B, C, D, F, I'd say, B minus, B. That's my honest assessment. I mean, it's so easy to be the backseat driver, and people making policies know much more than I do. For every one of me, there's 1,000 that they have, actually doing the analytics with the data that's actually from the source. So, I want to say, Paul, that prices have stabilized. If you look at the value of the ruble today, it's not much worse than it was. It's certainly much better than it was during that crisis point. And it's the view was that if they could get it stable around 64 rubles to the euro, that would be good. And I haven't looked to see the exchange rate today, but I'd imagine it's not too far from there.
Well, okay, so this is in terms of, let's say, modernizing and freeing the economy from, Western domination or something. But what about, how would you grade how they've handled things in the Ukraine? Not just from the time of the coup, but let's say from the time, I don't know, things got hot there.
I think that in terms of overall, in trying to stabilize the situation in Ukraine, meant that they had to give as much support to Poroshenko as possible, while through their media and through their political activists, of course, continually denouncing Poroshenko and opposing everything that he says or does. And in reality, the Russians were actually trying to keep Poroshenko in place to avoid alternatives that would have actually been destabilizing. And Poroshenko continually was getting pushed to do destabilizing things and then getting pushed back by the Russians and so forth. Where the Russians really failed, I think, was on these smaller personality stories and micro level things that are of tremendous significance and are hugely symbolic. So, in reality, you have, in terms of their technical abilities and so forth, people like the leaders Givi or Motorola, who were assassinated, are replaceable. But in terms of what they mean, what they meant symbolically to this conflict, to this struggle, they were irreplaceable. And I think that the Russian state really let down these rebels in terms of providing that extra covert level of security, even if it's just, hey, don't go home right now, or that sort of support isn't there, and it needed to be. And given that we've already established on your show that indeed, of course, the Russians have been backing the rebels 100%, all of the support from the rebels has been coming from Russia. Of course, there's symbolic support and meaningful support and popular support from Donbass Russians, ethnic Russians in Ukraine. But of course, talking about the real nuts and bolts stuff, the money, the hardware, military, tactical, strategic stuff has been Russia, right? So the fact that they let down there is, I think, makes Russia look really bad. The patriots, right, are very pissed at Putin, as much as they're pissed at the Ukrainians for, carrying this out. That's expected of them, right? They're the enemy. They're supposed to try to do that, but it was the Russians' job to actually protect these guys, and they didn't. That, I think, was a huge recent setback in morale and in perceptions in the Donbass. Now you have McCain pushing for this madness everywhere. He seems to be like the CIA's guy in the Senate, at least the most public one. Of course, there probably 49 of the 50 are CIA guys in the Senate, but
he's the guy who has the most pizza in his anyway.
Yeah, he's got the most pasta on his pizza, maybe. So
like that. All kinds of walnut sauce and
yeah. Well, yeah.
Anyway, we could get into that, but okay. Well, you talked about Poroshenko and stabilizing it, and the goal they had to stabilize things is totally rational, even if it's kind of questionable in terms of whether you're better off doing that or not, but totally rational anyway.
Right.
But what about, so that's why they recognized him and did everything they could to not, cause trouble for him.
Right.
But that's only part of the question, because there's the whole thing before he came to power. And then there's, just as an example, Pavel Gubarov in his book, argued that, Russia could have done all kinds of things with very, very few bribes and minimal help and, snatching one or two people here and there, because there was no functioning government in the Ukraine after the coup.
Right.
And, Russia could have, worked with the oligarch in Kharkov, Kernis or whatever, and just said, okay, we want, this. And, Russia took, I don't know how to put it, but took this very aggressive, quick lightning strike with the Crimea. And then it's almost like everything else was a prevent defense.
Right. I mean, there was
Now,
also,
I don't want.
I mean,
I'm not trying to be overly critical here. That might
no,
sound
no, no.
harsh.
It's
I'm
we
not
have
one
to
of
be.
those
We have to answer the right
ultra-nationalist
question. No,
patriots.
you are on the right questions. I mean, and I think that why they would have set up. I mean, we remember at the big battles over a year ago, 2 years ago at Double Seven.
Yeah, sure.
So we had,
But that
of course,
again, you have a victory and then you stop. And it's like,
right.
in the history
Yes,
of war,
yes.
like what they're doing is it's like, oh, we just, won the Battle of Kursk or whatever. We just won. Now let's like take a break and have a negotiate. It's kind of
Let
like,
them regroup. Let them regroup.
And it's like, it's not like NATO is lacking in, supplies and money, right? They print the money. So you sit there and you say, even like not taking Mariupol.
Right.
And, you sit there and I've heard arguments, well, they could have flooded it and you needed this stamp on exports to say made in the Ukraine, and this would make the local oligarch Akhmetov unhappy and all this. But you sit there and say, yeah, but sure. But I don't know. I've been in certain fights of certain kinds and sporting activities and whatever. And, morale and timing are really, really important. And like, you just sit there and say, like you were saying with Givi and Motorola's assassinations, it just seems to me that I find it demoralizing to say, I'm going to take all your punches and then eventually I'm going to get tired of it. And then I'm going to hurt you a little bit, but I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to stop. It just seems very, I understand some of the politics, but anyway, it just seems to me like a total prevent defense. And the question is, okay.
Yeah, it's a prevent defense, but also, so you have, but just on the subject of the morale of the Ukrainian army and who's going to fight, to simplify things, perhaps at the expense of an accurate model. But for conceptual purposes, let's say that there's two types of Ukrainian soldiers. You have a conscript who has really no interest in dying, and then you've got these volunteer brigades that are neo-Nazis, and they've got a sort of misanthropic view, and they're very much okay with self-sacrifice. Okay, so there's a limited number of those people, and I think that that by allowing there to be a conflict, instead of just swooping in and taking this and that, and then preventing the possibility in the short term of these Nazi type brigades doing something, it was better just to let them bleed out and go and march into the meat grinder as they did. You can look at photos. We can look. So I follow several people, and as you guys and we've talked about on the show before, I know people on the other side. And if you follow them and look at sort of from their personal photos and at events, looking, for example, at the Azov Brigade. Look at Azov Brigade 3 years ago, and you had all these 25, 35-year-old guys, on testosterone, steroids.
20,000 of them.
20,000 of them, guns, just gung-ho. Look at them today, and it's all a bunch of 17-year-old kids that can't even fill out an Azov Brigade T-shirt. Okay. So you've got the next generation they're trying to train, but I think that right now they don't have what it takes. So what you have right now is these guys who are the regular army. They're being bullied and harassed and even sometimes shot by the volunteer brigades. Their own commanders might be closer ideologically to volunteer brigades, or were put over regular units from volunteer brigades as something like an attaché or political advisor to the standard, say, field captain. And they're forcing these Ukrainian soldiers to, fire off the artillery rounds. And these guys are willing to do that because it's their job, and they're going to get, court-martialed or killed if they don't. But you're not going to get these guys to storm, with gun and bayonet in hand right into the trenches. That's just not going to happen again, I think, under the present situation, not with any success. And I think they know that. So it's already been the cover up over the number of deaths that Ukrainians suffered in their invasion of the Donbass has been very difficult for them to cover that up. And so even in the nationalist media, they attack Poroshenko, and what they do is they've been doing a propaganda. I don't know why, but in trying to undermine the military strategy, they've exposed the actual death count of Ukrainian soldiers in the tens and tens of thousands, right?
Sure.
And this is, of course, not what the government was saying. They thought, 4,000, 3,000. And so the public's like, well, the public actually, whether they are critical of what's happening from the left or they're critical of what's happening from the right, they're all getting the sense that tens of thousands is the number. And then you've got people like Savchenko, the pilot who was captured under questionable circumstances. Then she was held captive for, was it 2 years, and then released singing a different tune. And, she's saying that we need to recognize we need to put the Minsk agreement into effect. Basically, I mean, she can talk anti-Minsk language, but in effect, she's saying, she can criticize the details of it, but in effect, she's saying that basically we don't want these Russians in our country. Let's kick them out. Let's let that little group just separate, join Russia, whatever, and get out of our hair, and we'll carry on. And because she was such a sensation, and she was made such a symbol of Ukrainian effort.
Well, yeah. That was certainly a poisoned pawn, to use a chess term. There, Russia giving her back was like,
right.
Boy, that was not painful. That was a real good thing to get rid of. Okay, so before we wrap it up, then, though, where would you see things going? Let's since we're on the Ukraine, where, what might we see, a year from now or something?
In less than a year, it's really going to depend on whether what Trump was saying his actual goals were his actual goals, and then secondly, if he's in the position to put those into effect. So if in the scenario that he was accurately saying what he thought should be the policy moving forward, and if he is able to, in this scenario, get out of this box that the CIA is putting around him, then I do think that we would see not a recognition of Crimea, but just dropping the subject the way that we don't hear much about South Ossetia or Abkhazia anymore in the news, and just let the economics of the Donbass sort itself out. And I think that we would perhaps see, somebody. Yeah, I think we would see somebody like. No, I don't think they can really freeze it. I think that the similarity with South Ossetia and Abkhazia kind of ends there, but in terms of the analogy, but rather moving forward, I think that under this, best possible scenario, that Trump, is legit and that he's able to do it, that he would get behind someone like Timoshenko. I think we've seen big signs of that already publicly. So those balloons have been floated already. And so then Trump would back Timoshenko. Timoshenko would continue with her standard operating procedure of talking bad about Russia while making good deals with Russia. And move on like that. That's on Ukraine. Now on Ukraine, on the alternative, I think we would try to see some attempt to actually, in the worst case, to involve Baltic states and Poland in actually using more and more mercenaries, more and more hitmen to carry out actually more and more aggression, whether it's small terrorism or some type of explosions in the Donbass, assassinations, and to force Russia's hand. I think one of the things that the West has found it's very hard to do is to force Russia's hand. Russia's general policy is to exhibit strength by not reacting. Obviously, if someone can force your hand, they've already predicted when you're going to move.
Well, they can make you move.
Right. and there's only so many ways you can move. If you're forced to move, you're predictable. So if you don't move, it's hard, it kind of messes up that plan. And then if Russia were to respond, their general approach is to do it in their own time and in ways that make sense to them when they see the opportunity works. So certainly I would also expect there to be in that event, some retaliatory assassinations. I think we would see some of the Ukrainian personalities and figures of these various groups be offed in a parallel way that Givi and Motorola were offed, and it would continue on in that line. But the economics isn't stable. The economics keeps changing, right? So it's and things can't stay the same. That's why I've consistently said that the prior frozen conflicts is not a model that is going to really work moving forward. I think that that the defensive posture is probably more accurate, but the Russians are actually actively trying to change the government in Georgia in general, actively trying to change government in Ukraine in general. But how can they do that? They're really in a position of trying to assess to what extent, and I'm in a position of trying to determine, I should say, and from what I see and how they're acting, they're doing a very good job in making it look like they are trying to figure out how to react. How deep that goes, I don't know. Are they posturing, confusion? But they're certainly taking a wait and see approach to see how this new administration sorts itself out.
Well, but Joaquin, not trying to be like one of those Slavic pessimists, but Trump his whole persona and image is the deal, right? So we want a deal. Okay, so whether you're talking Syria or whether you're talking, the Ukraine, okay, but what deals can the Kremlin live with, right? I mean, in Syria, can they live with a Kurdish state, for example, or a quasi-state that the U.S. or Israel will control? In the Ukraine, can they deal with keeping the Donbass but having the rest of it, basically occupied forever, or what? You know what I'm trying to say? What is the deal?
Yeah. No, the certainly, I think Trump's deal is actually to disengage with Russia almost entirely and to actually take something close to a hands-off approach to Eurasian integration that favors Russia over China. The moves will be actually, if Trump is not successful under the scenario that he's saying who he says he is and so forth, I think actually we're going to see the problems in Russia be in the west of the Russian Federation, whereas if they're successful in trying to push Russia and to stoke the tensions between Russia and China, there are real tensions. There are real contradictions in their relationship. This goes against the narrative of the axis of resistance, right? That is popular.
I'm still looking for that axis, by the way.
I'm sympathetic.
When you find it, let me know.
I'm sympathetic to it being there. I'm sympathetic to it coming into fruition. We've seen moments of it. I mean, it's certainly a reality in many conflicts, but at the same time, there are certainly a lot of Chinese-looking people in the east to southeast of Russian Federation who China probably sees as being ethnic Chinese. I don't think that there is a dominant view in the Chinese leadership that they want to increase their territory right north into the Pacific Russian territories. But the U.S. would certainly like to believe that something like that is there, or to find those people in Chinese leadership. So U.S. would be taking a multi-vectored approach. Now, all of that said, again, we still have to figure out to what extent Trump is doing what he says he wants to do, and to what extent the CIA or the deep state, et cetera, is keeping him from doing that. That's really where it's at right now.
Well, we'll just have to wait and see. I would not see. I mean, I don't imagine the president has that kind of power. I think that they have to have the buy-in of different groups, and so any kind of deal in Syria or the Ukraine, I think it's not going to be so easy as it's just a totally winning deal for the Kremlin. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah, no,
you can win on the battlefield, and then you can set the terms. But if that doesn't happen, because at the table inside D.C. are going to be, people like the State Department and the DIA, the NSA, these players, and I just can't imagine that. Okay, let's say it's putting in Tymoshenko. Okay, and she likes money, so she'll sell what she can, right? So the pipelines, the leases on the Crimea, but that's no longer sellable. So I'm not sure what else she can sell anymore. She could sell the Azov battalion down the river if she could find a way to do that. But you know what I'm trying to say. At the end of the day, it's still the U.S. or the West or whoever that kind of calls the shots there. And, at the end, sure, the U.S. is willing to sell, but what's Russia willing to pay? That's the question.
Right.
And I'm saying the same thing with Syria.
I mean, in sort of remembering now some of the little details of the stories, we remember, I think, that there was some publicity around the story that one of the locations of anti-Trump attempts to build anti-Trump sentiments were in Ukraine, and so that would seem to me to clearly indicate that there was a legitimate concern in those Americans, which is the dominant wing, invested in Ukraine, that they really were against Trump, that it wasn't some sort of psychological operation, that Trump is not the Obama of the Republicans. That's certainly a possibility that cannot, at this point, be set aside. So
in other words, the situation in the U.S. has succeeded in confusing everyone in the U.S. and everyone in the rest of the world.
Right. So that's a success.
They've done it.
That's an American success on that point there, because it is absolutely right.
That's true. Well, I tell you what, we can wrap it up soon, but are there any other things we kind of didn't get into that you think are worthy of mentioning the last year or so of whatever's going on or changing?
I think that the Pizzagate issue, interest in it, if you look at Google Analytics, is still strong. It's not as strong as it was right around the time of the election, but it is still a trending phrase, trending search term. Pizzagate, I think, is a big internal American thing that is the people who are invested in that are very hardcore activists, and they've been pushing this for a long time before it was called Pizzagate, and that is I think a big factor in terms of how Americans will view their establishment. I think that was the first time in American history that the understanding of the global and America-wide pedophilia and rape, torture, kill cult of harming and killing infants, ritual sacrifice, and all of the characters involved, people following the Pizzagate story would know very well. That despite some errors, made by public journalists and YouTubers in getting certain facts wrong or right, is really secondary to the fact that this ring exists at the very highest levels, probably including Podesta and Clinton's and everybody. So that why they would do that, of course, is so that those who actually rule the United States have something on them. And of course, it's also internally a coherent type of a pseudo ideology or pseudo religion, like a cult that operates at the top level to keep everyone involved, tainted, and committed at the same time. If Americans push on that, I think that would push things in the right direction. It's got to move beyond, policy issues. It's got to move beyond even questions of war and peace. It's actually, I think that that Americans really are in the position to further publicly show other Americans into the world that those running the United States are not just capitalists or corporatists or fascists or globalists or whatever, that these are something like Satanists or something like this. I mean, I'm not putting a religious view on this of my own.
I know what you're saying is I don't want to badmouth Satanists because they might not be as bad as what these people are.
In reality, that's in fact what I'm saying. So
I've met these people Satanists. They're not always so bad, but these guys.
Well, you've got Anton LaVey, the Luciferian guys, and
of course.
These are more like libertarians and stuff. But
they're like libertarians who like to wear black and have.
It was like a rhetorical. It was like.
I'm with you.
Well,
I would say a couple of things on this that are important. First of all, today or whatever, Trump just had his high-level meeting on human trafficking, and I think that's the first time in American history a president's done that. And that's a big deal. And it's especially a big deal because we know from the various leaks of different sorts that, for that matter, just reading the Podesta emails, what can you say? I would point out, though, a lot of people have moved away from the term Pizzagate. They don't like it because it's so limiting. They are going with Pedogate. And so you kind of need to search on both terms nowadays. A lot of people want to get away for several reasons. One is the Comet Ping Pong is only one small part of the puzzle. Right. And obviously there are events and locations and things that have been going on a long time all over. And that's just kind of like the latest, data point in the game. But I agree with you. I actually think that could bring down a tremendous... Even if it's selectively used, it could bring down a lot of big players like McCain and Schumer and might force a number of other players to retire, And that could open up the game a little bit, if you got rid of some of these particularly nasty forces like McCain. But it would also, it would like inspire people to say, hey, I could move up, existing politicians, right? They could say, hey, there's a chance that I don't have to do that, right? To survive. Right. I could actually win and be a senator without doing something I refuse to do.
Right.
And it would open up the game tremendously. And it would also, particularly if it's done in a somewhat bipartisan manner, it would help Trump in the sense of trying to do new things. People would be so revolted, right, with the idea that let's just, even if you only got two guys, Schumer and McCain, one Republican, one Democrat, but they're so powerful, they're so representative of the system, right, that bringing them down would just revolt like 95% of the population. You'd just be disgusted beyond belief. And that would be very helpful. That would definitely help Trump do whatever it is he wants to do. But then we get back to we're not exactly sure what he wants to do. But that's a whole nother issue. But I think this is a wild card, and that's why I think I asked you if you had any thoughts on the Samson option, because that is indeed one of their options, is to say if you're going to break this stuff, then we've got some nukes in the Middle East or whatever. You know what I mean? Whatever. We gotta go nuclear, so to speak, because. There's no way backing down for these guys. They're in beyond the point of no return. So that's a big question too.
Big time.
But
wait,
anyway,
big league.
Big league. That's a big league kind of question, I would say, for the future of mankind, not just Americans or something. Well, I tell you what, it's been a great chat. Have to do it more often. Took a while there, and keep up the great work with your articles. You want to tell us where we can find some of your work?
Sure, and thanks, Paul, again for having me on. So we have our think tank in Belgrade is the Center for Syncretic Studies. Events that we are doing, conferences we are involved in, and special articles that we publish on Center for Syncretic Studies. It's a website. Search Center for Syncretic Studies. It's always the first hit. We're the only ones. Our news portal and operation. Coming out of this is Fort Roos News, www.fort-roos.com. And Fort Roos News is a popular destination point for many webizens looking for inside information on Russia, coming from people living in Eurasia, Eastern Bloc, so to speak, and Russia. This is a very popular site. We get breaking stories, we lead stories. We've been able to get stories out that before other more popular sites have, like Sputnik or Russia Insider, who are backed by the Kremlin. We, on the other hand, are 100% and fiercely independent of any state or government or institution outside of our own Center for Strategic Studies, independently operating in Belgrade since 2013. In addition to that, we advise and engage actively in a global political movement oriented towards youth activists, generally called New Resistance. It's very large in Brazil. It's popular in the United States. We just opened a chapter in England and in Italy, building our membership, our activists, doing cadre vanguard type training and ideological training, and building a generation of political soldiers. We generally think that the conditions in the world will destabilize. That's what we're planning on. And if that doesn't happen, great. If it does happen, we're ready.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks again for your time. Till next time, folks, it's a wrap. Take care.